So hi, everybody. Welcome. Steve Cady here at Bowling Green State University with our doctorate in organization development and change. And it is a professional doctorate that brings together people from all over the country and now world in many cases that are committed to transforming organizations, revitalizing communities, and developing human potential. And our commitment is to professional joy. And the notion is that we can experience joy through thought leadership. And then getting a doctorate enables us to share what we know in ways that I call passive difference making, like passive income, where you make money while you sleep. This is making a difference while you sleep. And so it's in the power of the written word, because the written word can change the world. And in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And when it's complemented by now rich media and all kinds of other digital and technical ways of supportive content, we can really reach a lot of people in very important ways. So it's a great time for us. Those of us here, like honey, we are the bees drawn to believing in the best of human beings. That's why we're here today. And we are together wanting to make that difference. I just returned, and Rosa, this goes back to the conversation before we hit record. I just returned from the Dean's Conference, 1,500 deans, College of Business deans from around the world in Chicago. And I gave a talk on transformational change. And it was quite enlightening to spend time with a room full of deans and large conversations with deans from all around the world, literally all around the world, doing in College of Business. My point that I made when I was giving the talk was that we are uniquely positioned to make a very important difference right now in our world. Through education, through higher education. And it's shifting. The idea that we teach people using traditional methods from the 40s and 50s, because schools from the 40s and 50s served an important purpose. And that was to train people to work in factory settings. And that was during the industrialization eras. And it taught people to do a couple things. One, just check their brain at the door, come in and do the work that they're told to do. And that worked at that time. Now, with everything that we know that's going on, that's changing dramatically. And the ability for us to collaborate, to be creative, to think at higher levels of abstraction, those are the things, Rosa, you were talking about that prompted me to think about, what are these doctoral programs doing? Rosa, congratulations, everybody, give her a high five. She's got her dissertation done. She's turned it in. It's getting printed. And she's done a lot of really good work. And it takes time to do that. And when you put it in writing and put it out there, it touches people's lives. And when you think about how we in doctoral programs have this deep learning experience, I told the deans, I said, we need to practice what we teach. The way in which we create transformation in higher education, the way we engage people more collaboratively, and how we have to co-create our futures together. It's directly related to what we need to do in the classrooms in the best of teaching, flipping the classroom, and all of those things. What we do in the classroom is what we do when we lead change, and what we do when we lead change is what we need to be doing in the classroom, because we are engaging the whole brain and the whole person now, and nobody is checking their brain at the door anymore. You know, they can't. We can't do that. And the world needs us now more than ever, particularly those in higher education. So when you look at the topic that Rosa is speaking on today, and you all are here for that, around the importance of creativity, the importance of collective wisdom, and the role of dynamic facilitation in the work you're doing in your dissertation, Rosa, it's so important. And I'm excited. And I have to tell you, the feedback I got from deans, I wasn't sure, right? Because it's deans of colleges of business. It was embraced. There was a curiosity and an enthusiasm, and I see a real shift kind of in what's happening. So I'm hopeful in the midst of what I think is a very trying time that we're in. I think we have two ways of focusing at this moment: as a problem or as a future for us to create that's hopeful. And I think when we focus on that, we're going to have more of that future that's hopeful. So what I'd offer for us right now is an opportunity to let's settle in and welcome Rosa, and welcome Dr. Rosa to our our session today. I'm really grateful, Rosa. I've known you for years. You've just been such a genuine giver of what you know, and wanting to be of service. What I'd like to do to start, to introduce Rosa and to get to know Rosa, is I'd like us all to take a minute to breathe into our groundedness that we typically do. So wherever you are, wherever you're sitting, and if you're able to take your cameras off, if you can't, that's fine. I respect that. But if you're able to, and when you're able to, know that you're welcome. If you're eating, I'm happy with you eating with your camera on and being with us like we're at a meal. If you are just wanting to relax and not, that's fine too. I want you to know that you're welcome here, however you can be here. But the more we can connect with you visually, for Rosa, the more helpful that is. But I'd like you to get grounded. And let's take about 5-10 seconds to just be quiet and get grounded. And I'd like you, as you do this 5-10 seconds, I'd like you to go to a time early in your life, in your childhood, go to your earliest memory that is connected to what you care about in the world, your work in the world. So let's take 10 seconds to go and settle into that. So Rosa, I'll start with the image that came to mind for me. And then I'd love to hear you tell us the image or what you were reflecting on that came to you and how it connects to what you're bringing to us today. And then we'll get started. So for me, I remember the image was me as a young boy, probably 7 or 8. And a friend of mine was playing the ball and the little things you drop it and you grab. What do you call that? Can someone remind me? The game.
Jacks.
Jacks, right? Playing jacks. And I was playing jacks, and I remember someone talking to me about something that was going on, and I remember saying something along the lines of, "I can't wait till I'm old enough to take care of myself, so that I can do what I want for me." And so, and how that connects is that to where I'm at today with us and our work. It's about how do we create a world where people have more of an ability to take care of themselves and take care of each other together in ways that we really hear each other and that we have a voice in how we take care of ourselves with others, not alone. Now, I don't want to be taking care of myself alone. But I remember thinking I just wanted to have a voice in how I take care of myself. And I remember I didn't have that voice. And that's what is I'm reflecting on. So Rosa, tell us a little bit about what you're reflecting on and bring us into what you want to talk about today, and then we'll go with you on this journey.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's such a deep, deep pleasure to be here. The memory that comes to mind has to do with my dad. And with the best of intentions, he felt the need to train me to defend myself verbally. He's a working class Latin American male, first in his family to graduate from high school, let alone go to college and let alone become a doctor. And it was I just remember as a teenager, whenever I had a different perspective than his, just really having to like argue with him and defend myself. I just wanted to be heard. I just wanted to be listened, and then I remember being in college at one point. He was very proud that I'd gotten into Oberlin and came out to visit me. And I had just been reading some wonderful books I'll talk about a little bit later, but I decided to try an experiment. And I said to him, Dad, would you be willing to listen to me? And, like just to listen. And I tried to explain a little bit about the kind of listening I wanted. And he just kind of was very stern, and he was looking at some of the political posters and banners that were at the place we were meeting, and some of them I think were triggering to him. So he looked at his watch and said, "Okay, I'm listening." At that point, I just realized that this experiment wasn't going to go very far. So I um, said, "That's okay, Dad. We'll try again another time." But it really, I think, not being heard in my childhood and young adulthood really taught me a lot about the importance of listening and the importance of feeling heard by contrast, by negative example. So with
Oh,
that,
man. That's
yeah,
amazing. Yeah. I'm thinking about breakfast this morning with my sons, and I'm thinking I want to make sure I really listen. I have I have a 9-year-old and a 16-year-old, and we were talking and debating a few things. And I go back and I think, and maybe I laid down the law a little bit too quickly. I need to like explore with them and really listen, and make sure I do that more.
yeah. Well, I loved in your story that you were talking about playing jacks, because I used to play jacks as a kid. So I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
another little
Yeah.
connection.
So
So
being
yeah.
heard, being heard. So tell us about today,
So
Rosa.
today, can I start sharing some slides because it
Yeah,
will,
please. Yeah,
okay.
sure.
Absolutely.
So bear with me a moment. Um, I'm going to share here, and then I think I go to start slideshow, and okay. So dynamic facilitation and agile deliberation, awakening the spirit of creative collaboration. And I think if I return, will it go to the next slide? Yes. Okay. So I wanted to say that one of the things I'm celebrating right now is OD for Life, this wonderful movement about how OD can contribute as much as possible to the world that we're in. And Michelle Holliday's book is on my reading list. I've just ordered it. And I just wanted to say, so this is why when I was thinking about what is the purpose of my being here to today, for me, I feel really strongly we need OG for the collaborative redesign of human and organizational systems, including, as you were saying, Steve, universities and schools but like all of them, right? We really need to and collaborative redesign, and including OD for collaborative governance, which is going to be the theme of my mini presentation today, because I really want to also have a lot of dialogue. And so my intention is to help expand a sense of how our OD informed mindset, values, experience, skills, and knowledge can be applied in various ways and in various fields, right? So I have here a Foursquare, which is a parallel to the Foursquare in my newsletter. I've just kind of created this graphic organizer for myself to kind of keep track of my various interests, because I'm very interdisciplinary. But one of the things I love about OD, and one of the reasons I ended up in OD, is how I had a lot of trauma in my childhood, as I've referred to, and I spent my 20s doing a lot of personal growth and healing and spirituality stuff. And there'd be a couple of OD consultants there. And I was like, what is this career where people from the belly of the beast, because my initial identification was as a social change activist, and I saw corporations as like, wow, some of the source of some of the challenges in our world, which I still believe is the case, while at the same time, I also feel they're very much a part of the solution. But still, there would be all these OD consultants in these various personal growth and spiritual practices, places I was at. And so I was like, what is this profession where people are continuously developing self as instrument and involved in lifelong learning? But one of the things I want to say about this quadrant is that personal transformation isn't something we just do alone, right? It often happens in an interpersonal context. And I could go on and on about that, but I want to now go to deep listening on an organizational level. And so dialogue as the capacity of a system to see itself is one of my favorite quotes from Sharma. And then, there's all this bringing the whole system into the room, and so many ways of doing that, future search, open space technology, all of the large group interventions, as they were called before Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak named and developed the category of dialogic OD. So it's not just us who are doing the listening as OD consultants. We are creating opportunities for people to hear one another and for the system to see itself. Another of the applications of listening that means a whole bunch to me is deep listening across societal divides. So here I'm just naming a few of the many organizations and movements that are doing good work along these lines that we can learn more about, align with, and support. And then this fourth one is deep listening, excuse me, in the context of collaborative governance. And so Forrester's work, John Forrester is a professor of planning at Cornell, and his work, which I'll show you in a moment, on facilitators of and mediators and moderators of multi-stakeholder processes was what inspired me to return to school for a PhD in 2014. And so the topic of my dissertation, which I can talk a little bit more about in a bit, is facilitated mini publics as democratic innovations. So these are Forrester's books, Dealing with Differences, Dramas of Mediating Public Disputes, and Planning in the Face of Conflict, The Surprising Possibilities of Facilitative Leadership. He's written many more. These are just the two that I first landed on that inspired me tremendously. And one of the things I love about his work is, so I have a whole perspective I'm not going to launch in too much right now on the relationship between practice and research, and how to have a, non-extractive relationship between the two worlds, and also the prevalent myth, which is another book, Donald Schoen's Reflective Practitioner. He writes about how the myth of technical rationality assumes that everything is discovered in the controlled science lab, and then practitioners are supposed to follow best practice informed by science that leads the way. And the truth is that, or one truth, as many of us see it, is that actually practitioners tend to be 10 years ahead of the theory in any practice informed field, because we're continuously experimenting, trying things out, doing practitioner research in the course of our practice, right? So the beautiful thing about John Forrester's books is that he presents a lot of the narratives of, he calls it practitioner narratives or practice stories of practitioners who facilitate these highly conflictual, multi-stakeholder, water use, land use, et cetera. And they are talking at a very high level of detail about the work that they do. So as a practitioner, now I identify as a pracademic, of course, but when I first read these, I had not made the commitment to go back for the PhD yet. I felt like I could learn so much from reading these other practitioner stories, and then he reflects on them and does this amazing job of interpreting them and adding to them. So it's not like his voice isn't present also, but it's very much much more on a par. I highly recommend his work. And so now I want to say a little bit about where I chose to apply it instead of the context of multi-stakeholder negotiations. This is the context of public deliberation. In 2020, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development published this 200-page white paper, Innovative Citizen Participation in New Democratic Institutions on Sortition-Based Mini-Publics. And I'll just say a little bit about what those are in a moment. Here are some of you may have heard about the citizens' assemblies. There have been some very well publicized ones in Ireland and in France, et cetera. There's citizen juries, which have been around for a long time. Citizens councils, which is the one that I focused my dissertation on, deliberative polling, which comes out of Stanford, et cetera. And two more slides, and then I'm going to go back to listening. But I have more slides I can bring up later, but I'm about to get to a pause point here. This is a graphic I created to illustrate the three different elements of sortition-based mini-publics, which is the topic of the OECD report. So sortition means like a public lottery, right? So an analogy is the way that in polls, people are chosen at random to be statistically relevant when it comes to information about the larger whole. A lot of the sortition-based mini publics aren't large enough to be statistically relevant in that way, but there's still the principle that choosing people at random from a database of, say, voter registration folks or like that just helps bring in more than the usual suspects who would tend to show up, right? And so sortition has become a real big part of these processes. And then all of them are facilitated. So it's a facilitated process of working through an issue. And then we want influence because, we're talking about public policy. So we want for this work to actually go somewhere. And so in the diagram, what I'm trying to show is that there are things that are sortition that are not sortition-based facilitated mini publics. There are other forms of policy dialogues that are not sortition-based. There's other forms of having influence. But the area that I'm looking at is the area right there in the middle of, whoops, now I'm going to need to go back, which is where all of these processes live: the citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, planning cells, and the citizen councils. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I just want to say before going forward, I want to acknowledge the problematic aspect of the name of the councils. As a Latina, I'm very sensitive to the issues of othering, exclusion, and oppression that are created by the term citizen. And by the same token, John Alexander's book on the needed shift of thinking of people from consumers to citizens, he makes a distinction between being a citizen as a sign of as a status, as a sign of entitlement, which fascinating stuff in there because he goes into this at some depth. It more and more is something that the wealthy can purchase. Apparently, if you have enough money, you can, pay for a stay in a small European country and then become a citizen of the EU, in contrast to what he calls to citizen as a verb. So the activity of taking on responsibility for the shared life of our community. And thus, when we talk about it as a noun in that way, it denotes those who choose to take on responsibility for communal well-being at whatever level of system, right? Like this could be taking responsibility within a moving group of people who are refugees fleeing from their countries of birth for safety elsewhere, right? But it's that sense of taking responsibility for some degree of responsibility for the larger whole. So I thought this would be a good place to pause and see if there's any comments or questions. I do have some slides on what the citizens' councils that I've studied in Austria are structured like and how they work and all that. But I just thought I would check in and see whether it makes sense.
And Rosa, maybe we could take this 3 minutes to put them into small breakouts because we do have a nice group here.
Okay.
Give everybody a chance to reflect on. If you have a question you'd like them to reflect on, what I would say is just introduce yourself, and what are your reactions to what you heard, and what are you curious about? and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes. Would that work for you, Rosa?
Sounds great.
All right,
Absolutely.
so I'm going to put you all in groups. I've created the groups. I'm going to open all the rooms. You'll be invited in, and just come back with some reactions and some curiosity. So who are you? And then from there, what are your reactions? And then what questions or what are you curious about as you listen? There are the rooms. So jump on in, go make a new friend, or say hi to an old friend.
Just you and me here.
Yep. So pause. All right. So how did that go? Anybody want to share with Rosa some of your conversation? And Rosa, I know you went to and had probably some really nice conversation as well.
I'll share about our quartet. Each of us were very interested in the topic, and I think there's some examples from our shared history that will be informed about future practices. So, it was a great discussion, and some Cincinnati flavor too. Loving it.
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
I can share just a quick comment. I think one of the things that really resonated, Rosa, was when you said you wanted to listen, that you would stop talking and listen, and that concept of really listening and being present, reduction in that multitasking that we all do, I think really resonated. And I think it's an important pickup, I think, for all of us to listen, to understand, and really hear what it is you're saying. So thank you for sharing that.
In our group, we came onto two questions that are really driving us forward. One was we've had experiences of sorting to a degree, but frequently the sortation, it isn't really, we're really pulling among like minds. So how do we draw in a broader collective? And the other question was, I've noticed in much of the work I've done, especially in sort of the public sphere, do-gooder communities, that we're okay on the sortation, we're really good on the working through, but no influence and nothing moves forward. And that's just something that's sort of irking us, or irking me anyway. And I'm curious what that might point to. Thanks.
So would it make sense to respond a little bit, Steve?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, as you're ready.
So in our small group, someone had a question about sortition. So we did end up talking about that a bit after people had introduced themselves. And so I want to point out that one of the closest analogies we have is the jury process, where people are chosen at random from a pool. They're not voted in. They're not elected. And so if you can imagine a citizen's jury is like if a regular jury, instead of being tasked with trying to determine the innocence or guilt of a criminal case, was tasked with regard to this particular public policy, what is in the public interest? What is the common good? Right? So they get to study, they get to talk, they get to, look at it from different perspectives. And the purpose being to have people who are involved who aren't just the usual people who are active, to have a more diverse group of people at the table, although activists have a very important role in the system, but to not be hearing just from the activists, right? And in Austria, for the citizen councils, what happens in terms of And so then it's stratified. So it's sortition based and it's stratified. So if the first 4 names are men, well, you don't want to keep pulling the men. The next ones you pull, you'll be waiting until you get, you know, a woman and then we need to think about non-binary and all that. So it's a complicated process. And that aspect of it is not the aspect I was studying. I was studying more the facilitation aspect of it. But the purpose is to get a microcosm through a combination of sortition and stratification that is reflective of the diversity in the larger whole. And actually, in some cases, you want to over-represent people who are underrepresented in the larger whole, right? So there's a whole science and art to the process of creating the sortition-based groups. In terms of how you get people there, you know, in Austria, which is where I was studying, interviewing the facilitators online. I wasn't actually there, although I've been there a number of times to visit. The people who have been chosen through this public lottery get an official letter from the government entity that is sponsoring this, saying you have been chosen to participate in this process, etc. And then there is still the issue of how do you get the people who were invited to attend? So in Austria, they draw 500 names at random. Then out of the people who respond, they stratify to create a balanced group. But if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, you could say, well, there's self-selection in terms of the people who respond and the people who don't. So in Ireland, when they did the Irish citizens' assemblies there, which are much larger, over a greater period of time, more expensive, et cetera, they actually chose people at random, and then they would have people who would actually go and track them down and knock on their door and say, you know, you've received an invitation. We need you to respond in order to maintain the statistical integrity, et cetera. Even when there is less statistical integrity, there are still really valuable results from having a diverse group of people. But yeah, so there's different levels of depth at which this can be done. So Nicole Merkel is asking, how do you deal with resistance to this sortition-based process from those who are used to having political power and pull? Okay, so I had misunderstood your sentence when I first read it, and I was thinking you were talking about the electeds and the administrators who, and that's a whole part in and of itself, is doing the pre-work and the post-work to make sure that people are really receptive, because part of what happens here is that this is all a useless waste of time if it's just for show, right? If people do all this hard work of coming to consensus around a policy objective in a particular area, and then their work doesn't go anywhere, and you had brought this up before, Gordon, I believe, then it's worse than useless. People get cynical. People, you know, the next time, you know, it's like, who here has ever gone in to do a consulting thing with an organization? And it's like, oh yeah, the last time they did that, nothing came of it, right? I mean, it's net impact less than zero. So there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done with the sponsoring organizations, really working on getting their commitment to taking the recommendations seriously. You can't commit to signing a blank check. They can't say we're going to implement all this stuff and we don't even know what it is, but they can say we're going to look at it, we're going to implement what we can, and whatever we can't implement, we will respond and say why, right? So that's a whole process. And that actually this particular council in Austria has some, so maybe this is time for a quick whiz through a few more slides, because it'll show you.
And while you're pulling up, I'll share a little something that relates, and that is the research on answering surveys. When people get information and they don't know where they are in the number of questions, if you get a survey question like at the end of a service of some type, people will opt out and just check out if they don't know how many questions are going to be asked to answer. So they literally drop out of the survey at 1.5. In other words, after the first question, if it doesn't say where you are, half of
Wow,
them leave immediately.
fascinating.
The point of this is that if people who are participating don't know where they are in the process and how the process is going to be used, in terms of how it's going to, and they can't see how it's flowing and where they fit into and how it's going to gain up, they're going to check out early. Is really in the key. And what's interesting is there's other research that shows that when companies do surveys and they don't close the loop, that it's one of the biggest predictors of becoming unionized.
Wow. Wow. Powerful, powerful stuff.
Right, right.
So I want to honor Manfred Hellriegel here. He was the director of the a small state government department in the state of Vorarlberg, Austria, whose charge was sustainability and public engagement. And they had this wonderful Büro für Zukunftsfragen, in a literal sense means office for questions about the future. And they officially translated their name as Office for Future Related Issues. There is a book, Kim Stanley Robinson, it's a novel called something like Office for the Future, like that, which is a wonderful book about it's fiction, but it's a realistic thing of how we could actually address climate change. Highly recommend it. But at this small government office, they knew that you can't just pass a bunch of laws about sustainability without getting input from people. So that was why the pairing of sustainability and public engagement. So Manfred had prior experience working with the citizen juries and planning cells and other forms of public engagement. So when he was introduced in 2005 to Jim Ruff's dynamic facilitation approach and the Wisdom Council model, and a few years afterwards, he was introduced to the art of hosting. With all of these ingredients, Manfred and his team adapted the Wisdom Council model to create the Citizens Council. So now I'm going to just briefly go through the steps here. Yeah, that's everything I've just said. So of course, planning groups, right? You get people around the table, you start planning this, recruiting participants through sortition and stratified sampling and sending invitations, and then facilitated council sessions. They do a day and a half of an intense deep dive with dynamic facilitation. Here's another photo from a different council. So, and they have outcomes, shared statements, public policy recommendations. And then this is an innovative aspect of their model, is that then they have a citizens cafe that's using the World Cafe format. They present the story of their process and their findings at a large open public meeting where people come and hear about this and then have a chance to discuss about it in small groups and share out. You all, I imagine, are familiar with World Cafe process. So then at that cafe, public cafe, whoops, I did, okay, a responder group is formed, and the responder group is a new group, and it involves representatives of the different agencies that will be tasked with implementing the outcomes of this, plus a couple of representatives from the original council or the citizens who came to this public cafe. And so here, this was a 2015 statewide council on refugee and asylum seekers. Is the EU would assign a certain number to each country in the EU and then a certain number to each state. But the state had been just attempting to deal with this on its own without really informing people very much about what was going on. And so it was really a breakthrough when there was a citizens council about this. And so the makeup of the responder group, somebody from the Civic Council, somebody from the Chamber of Commerce, these two are nonprofits who were doing a lot of the work of supporting 4 different governmental departments, someone from the Association of the Local Authorities and someone from the Catholic Church, all these different people who before had been dealing with this in a somewhat siloed way, now being part of the responder group, had to sit around the table once a month to track what's happening with the recommendations of this council as it moves through the inner workings of the bureaucratic process. And then at the end of that 6-month period, come back and report back what has been implemented. And actually a lot was implemented from that council. And let me back up for a second. A lot was implemented from that, which I can talk about in a bit. But I want to mention here that this example of how the political culture can get transformed through institutionalization. So their yearly occurrence after years and years of work, at least I think about maybe 8 years of doing this at a local level, municipal level, then statewide, has now been written into the constitution of the state of Vorarlberg. So they commit to doing at least once of these per year. It can be initiated by the government, either by the state governor's office or by the state Congress, or if people get a petition going and say, we want one on this topic, and they get at least 1,000 signatures, the government is committed to hosting one on this process. And so this is, and so it's become an iterative process where you have the council, the cafe, the responders group, then it's incorporated into political agendas. Feedback is given to people in terms of what happened, and then there's a new one. So with that, I am ready to stop sharing again and see what questions, concerns, thoughts, inspirations we might have.
I have a question. Is that the format? I just asked my question.
Yeah.
So I'm first appreciative of just how well and how successful is and how you use the different tools. I also wrote myself a note and said, I wonder how the culture in Austria influenced the success of this, because I'm looking through, if you can imagine a filter that I'm looking through as a Black American woman at this success, and this my experience, and wondering your sense of the culture and how people feel about belonging and citizenship and patriotism would influence something like that.
That's a great question, Francis. I'm really glad you raised that. And I'm going to start by reflecting your question, if I may, so that I can make sure I've understood it. You're wondering, to what degree is the culture of a country like Austria, which may be much more homogenous, although becoming quickly less so than a country like the US, a factor in the possibility of this happening? Is that close?
That is, as a matter of fact, I was making it smaller.
Yeah.
A country like Austria versus the city of Chicago.
Right.
You know, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But just to go big for a moment, I really want to refer all of you to, and I don't have any slides on it. I apologize. I wasn't necessarily thinking it was coming up, but it was going to come up. But deliberative polling, Jim Fishkin out of Stanford in 2019, I believe, they did this 3-day massive stuff. Costs a lot of money when you do it as big as they do. I think they had 350, maybe 500 people. They called it America in One Room. Now, they're very scientific, the deliberative polling folks. So they are wanting to do their best to have this be really reflective of the diversity of the larger whole. And they bring people together and they do pre and post attitude surveys on some basic issues. This was a really, really substantial project. And there was very interesting results on how there was significant depolarization on key social issues. And they also had some lovely video, which I've not been able to find recently, of some of what happened as people encountered one another across class differences, across racial differences, which don't really exist, but we experience them, right? Across ethnic differences, across where we are situated, right? The world looks very different depending on where we're standing. And so it was amazing. I highly recommend it. I also feel strongly that, oh, and at, okay, hold on a second. Let me just breathe for a moment. Does that begin to address your question a little bit?
Yes, it wasn't so much, so my thinking is, if you think about how people feel their connection with their country and what the country stands for,
Yeah.
it's what I'm thinking about, may be significantly different, even if you could compare Austria and
Yes,
any part of US culture,
yes,
which would make it, which might affect your ability to be effective with those
right.
designs.
Right. And so American in One Room to me was an example of how huge differences in the United States can be bridged through careful design and facilitated process. It was a different process and a different one.
Right.
And it can still be true that the relationship of people in Austria to their sense of national identity is different than the relationship of people in the US to their sense of national identity, right?
And that's my point. It's
Yeah.
the relationship of people, how they identify with, not the diversity issue.
Right. And there was and I'm not remembering the name of it right now, but there was a people's panel on COVID in Michigan pretty recently that, again, it's like people are doing a lot of these experiments precisely to test to what degree can we bring people together productively across divides. And so far, the evidence is pretty darn good. It does not work without facilitation. You can't throw people into a room and expect things to work well, right? But with the adequate structure, and there's examples and examples and examples, and I can send you resource lists afterwards. But for instance, there's Hands Across the Hills, some people in Michigan in dialogue with some people in, I want to say Kentucky, but maybe it's not Kentucky. Just looking to bring, but it's a red state and a blue state, and bringing people together in dialogue. And it's being done in lots of different formats and in lots of different ways, not to scale, not as much as we need. But the evidence is that when people are in a facilitated context, good things can happen. And I hear that your question wasn't around ethnicity, it was around different relationships to this country and to national identity. And so I want to editorialize a little bit and say that it's a problem. I see it when we talk about democracy, because for a lot of people in this country, democracy sounds like the Democratic Party. And so if we're really trying to do this bridging stuff, it can be helpful to talk about our Republican democracy, because then we are, just even through the words we're using, right? Or our Democratic Republic, or, it's like there's all these words that are trigger words and code words for people who have very different views of the country. And so if we're trying to bring them together, there's a lot of thought that goes into it. So I'll just pause there and see if there are more questions or comments.
Well,
No.
Rosa, we're getting to a time to wrap up, and people can stay after and say hi and chat with you, but I want to have a formal wrap up, and then we can just stay on and linger for those that want to. So as part of the closure, I'd love to hear from you all in the chat. just a one line, what is the one thing you're taking away from today that you found particularly helpful or that you want to remember? One liner for Rosa to just have a little bit of a sense of where you all are.
Yeah, and I wonder if Rosa had a closing slide on anything that she could leave with us if we don't get a chance to talk about it. I mean,
Oh,
if you don't, it's okay, but I just wondered if there was.
I'm gonna repost Rosa's newsletter in the chat here in 1 second. I think that's a great starting point if you want to return to some of her and continued things that are bouncing around and where Rosa is active and sharing this.
Yeah.
I do have a slide I want to share while you guys are writing there. It's a single slide. In my dissertation, I did a lot of work looking at the facilitation of these processes in Austria, and there's, as I said, lots of different kinds and like that. And I also did a lot in the facilitation of these processes. There's a lot of active listening or listening out loud. And so I did a lot of work with looking at Carl Rogers' legacy. And so there's this one quote where he says, "On the basis of my experience, I have found that if I can help bring about a climate marked by genuineness, prizing, and understanding, then exciting things happen. Persons and groups in such a climate move away from rigidity and toward flexibility, away from dependence toward autonomy, away from defensiveness toward self-acceptance. They inhibit living proof of an actualizing tendency," which is something that today we might talk about as the, self-organizing ability of complex adaptive systems, right? But Rogers talked about it as the actualizing tendency. And yeah, so I am happy to close with that as my final slide, just saying that in Carl Rogers' day, a lot of his group was T groups, group work, which dynamic facilitation is very different than T groups. T groups tend to be confrontational. I see that as a fourth assumption that he smuggled in besides these three. But anyway, I'll stop. Thank you
No, it's
so
great. There's lots. And one person said they would love to have more time. And that's what we're doing, the symposia, as well as the All Things Change. We have every week, we have opportunities to have that discussion on Thursdays at 11 Eastern, as well as during the symposia once a month on the last Wednesday at noon. So these are opportunities. And Rosa, let's continue the conversation. Let's look at the discussion. You all can put in the chat before you go, what's a question you love to explore next? What are some thoughts? And Rosa, let's have another topic. And if we meet once a month and have this conversation, it's great. I think what I love, Rosa, is I've been, gathering through the Change Handbook and the Collaborative Change Library, all kinds of techniques and methods from around the world. And I'm always learning new ones or new terms or new things every single time. And I've been doing this forever, it feels like. And so this is great because I think a lot of people here felt like there were new ideas. David Bright said, I heard some terms I had never heard before. And it really is helpful for us to continue to connect this web of knowledge around this work. I think that's the key. And if I would say anything about transforming our world, going back to the original piece, this work needs to be as front and center as accounting is for organizations, okay? And doing taxes. And what I mean by that is we need to really think about this explicitly and intentionally as an important disciplined way for us to be together as human beings. And so Rosa, any goodbye you want to say? We'll stay on and linger for a little bit for those that want to.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure. I do hope to get a chance to continue and get to know some of you, et cetera. There's some great questions in the chat here. Something that I do a lot when I do workshops is I take the questions in the chat and then write stuff in response to them and send it in to folks. So I'm happy to do that. It may take me a little while because I'm about to go on a small road trip, but I could do that at some point next week because
Yeah.
Love to contribute to it.
And what we can do is we can take the recording and we send it out to everybody that signed, that registered. And we can send that along with maybe a collective response that you might give to some of the stuff, and we can just send it out.
Mhm.
And maybe anything else you want to share. If you'd like us to do it that way, we can find a way to connect. 'cause
Well, I mean, no,
everybody was
no,
reading
I'm happy to stay on now and talk about some of it, but
Yeah.
also if somebody wrote. the
also later, right?
Yeah, yeah. both
Right,
things.
right. We can do that later. So we'll do a follow-up for all of you here that have to go. We'll
Mhm.
also follow up with some of the chat, the conversation reflection from Rosa, along with the recording. So with that, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon. So bye for now. And now we linger.
Yes.
Yeah, Rosa, I had
Mm.
about a dozen requests from people that couldn't be here that had registered and or, oh, I can't attend. Hopefully there'll be a recording, so
Yeah.
it'd be lovely to do a follow-up. I told people that couldn't be here, well, at least register, so we'll have your information. We can send you a follow-up.
So Theo, one of the questions here, if you want to leave the recording on, one of the questions here is about the role of the facilitators in these councils. And I'm wondering, I could just show 5 minutes of slide on that so that that's on the recording. And
Yeah,
then,
yeah. We'll keep the lingering recording going as well.
okay.
So we'll turn
Awesome.
it off when we're officially fully done. We'll turn it. We'll stop
Okay.
recording.
Awesome, great. So, yeah, I'm looking at the questions. Does this have an impact on political polarization? I think it does. It just, it needs to be scaled. And somebody mentioned America Speaks. Yes. And how can we help our US culture to be serious about the value of including diverse voices and best to translate ideas from many voices? Yeah, great question. So I will respond to most of these after. I'd love to show a few of the dynamic facilitation slides if I may, since Donald is still here with us and this was your question. Would that work? Okay, so let's see, what do I need to do this? I need to, I think first do escape, and then I do share screen and share. And I think the DF ones are up here. Yes, the facilitation ones are up here. Okay, so now I do slideshow. So just a tiny bit about that didn't work. Sorry, while I scroll back tiny little bit, and here we go to dynamic facilitation. So first, the most important thing about it is that it's an open source process. There's a book that I wrote about it in English. There's the German translation, which has additional chapters from practitioners. There's a translation in Spanish. I was first introduced to it in March 2000 when I attended a dynamic facilitation skills seminar with Jim and Jean Ruff. Jim had developed an emergence-based solution-focused form of facilitation while working as a consultant and doing quality improvement work with shop floor workers in a sawmill on the Pacific Northwest. And I like to describe dynamic facilitation as a way of leveraging human beings' capacity as complex, adaptive, meaning-making organisms by fostering a nonlinear, agile, and highly empathic context. And I was very drawn to this work, and it was the inspiration for me to return to school for a master's program in OD at Sonoma State University. I graduated from there in 2002. So, collaborative sense-making approach for addressing complex issues offers a highly empathic environment, fostering creative engagement with wicked problems and divergent perspectives. And it's dialogic in that participants speak into the center rather than directly at one another. Some of you may have seen that sometimes when people talk about dialogue, they talk about, having a fire in the center of the circle and people are speaking into the fire instead of at each other. Well, we also do this in dynamic facilitation. And let's see. No. This is not where I wanted to go. Sorry, my mouse is jumping around a little bit. Those are the research findings, and I want to be back in the facilitation. So the facilitator's role is highly active. So they're listening out loud. There's a wonderful little book that just came out called Listening Out Loud, which is all about reflecting back to, Covey talked about it as listening to understand. Other people have talked about it as mirroring, looping, reflecting back, saying back. There's a lot of words for it, but the intention is to help people feel heard and to offer relational empathy, to create a climate of multi-partiality, taking all sides rather than impartial. And again, the intention being to maximize creative tension while minimizing interpersonal anxiety. So while holding space for emergence, the facilitators are welcoming initial solutions, which is how this differs from things like interest-based negotiation. The goal is the same, to help people let go of their initial ideas, but we find that actually welcoming people's initial ideas, reflecting them back, charting them, on the wall, helps people then be able to hear better when the next person says, well, I'm concerned because that's not going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And again, we're asking them to say that to the center. Some people in Germany have come up with the term, the facilitator as the walking, talking stick. So the facilitator is now listening to the concern and is inviting it, but asking the person to not direct it at the other person, because who knew? We are much better able to hear things when we're not, trying to jam something into one another's face. So this is what the facilitator does. And that last bit, we talk about it as protecting creativity. In brainstorming, we protect creativity by having different stages, right? Now we are just bringing in ideas. Later, we're going to evaluate them. In dynamic facilitation, we protect creativity through spatial redirection rather than through different stages in time. Yeah. And so Matthias Zurbanson is the person who invited Jim Ruff to Germany in 2005 to teach dynamic facilitation. Before he invited Jim, he had invited Marvin Weisbord and Sandra Janoff to teach about future search. He'd invited Harrison Owen to teach about open space. He was just inviting all these different people and then inviting all of his consultant friends and colleagues to come and attend workshops with these folks. So he really created some fertile ground for this practice. So when Jim started being invited by him to come and teach there were a lot of consultants who are already really hungry for different varieties of emergence-based practice, and it's really taken off in German-speaking countries. I wouldn't say it's much more well-known than it is here in the US, and it's just kind of on par with a lot of other approaches, whereas here it tends to be kind of not so well-known. And so at that first workshop that Matthias was hosting, Manfred was there, and that's how the whole civic council thing got started. So does that speak to your question, Donald?
Ich finde das ziemlich klasse.
I'm sorry?
I said in German, I think that's rather wonderful. I was agreeing with you.
Yes.
It is interesting how, language is one of the things that allows things to sort of get to a certain tipping point in some arena, some area, some cultural context faster than in others. And
Ich kann nur ein kleines bisschen Deutsch sprechen.
ja, das ist aber ganz schön gut. Muss man sich nicht beschweren.
Ich
So, okay,
auch.
we'll stop. Carol can also speak a little bit of German.
Ich auch.
Yeah,
I
so-
have to ask you, Rosa, as a continuation to this and with Teo, this uptake in Europe, particularly German-speaking countries,
Yes.
has been a curiosity for me since the beginning. Because it doesn't seem to match, as Francis would say, the culture. And I'm so curious from the beginning when you talked about this is really under the auspices of the government. How does the government get involved?
Okay, well, so let me break that down a little bit. So Manfred Hellriegel was the director of a small government office, you know, the Büro für Zukunft.
Ah,
It's like a technical assistance office. And so when municipalities in the state, when regions in the state were needing to do public engagement, then his office supported them in doing that and gave them technical advice, technical consultation. So public engagement is actually, you know, Britain is way ahead of the US when it comes
yes.
to public engagement. Germany is not so far behind, right? Their planning cells are similar to citizen juries, and Austria, I don't know so much about the rest of public engagement in Austria, but I'm sure that they do some of it because they had this planning engagement department that had worked with citizen juries, that had worked with planning cells, that had worked with all these different engagement modalities before Manfred discovered Jim's Wisdom Council model and dynamic facilitation. And what he liked about it was that because it's a deep dive emergence-based process that taps into creativity, you can, you know, it's like you open the hood of a Tesla and a Ford, and it's like, well, they're both cars, they both get you places, but one of them might be more fuel efficient or use a different kind of fuel altogether, right? And so he found it more cost effective to just get down to nuts and bolts, to do a process where in 2 days he could get what another process would require a week to do, right? So that's one of the reasons for the popularity of the model he developed, which, you know, he tweaked Jim's model quite a bit, left the core of it. Dynamic facilitation is at the core, but he tweaked it somewhat. And then it just, how to say this? I'm going to go back to Steve's talking about joy. When people have a space where they feel deeply seen and heard, and they have a chance to connect with one another, and there's a lot of psychological safety because we're taking out the competition and striving for who's going to be in and who's out. And we're talking about meaningful things and people are being heard. It's a joyous experience. And so it feels good. People really enjoy their experience being in a citizens council. And so it's spread. Does that speak at all to your question, Carol?
Rosa, if I may, I want to offer an opinion as somebody who grew up in German speaking, and you know, I've been in the US now since 2000. I grew up in East Germany. There's two aspects to this that I think also sort of speak to the question Francis asked earlier about, like, what does culture maybe have to do with how this is perceived? I think actually it has more to do with history than it has to do with culture specifically. And I think that's expressed in a couple of different ways. One symptom of which is that, if I'm not mistaken, the 2020 presidential election in the US of A had the highest ever voter turnout with something like 66, 67% or so. That is probably the lowest number that you'll find in Austria. I think I looked, and their most recent election was like 65 and change, and that was like the lowest in the last 10 years. Typically it's 75, 80% voter turnout. So that's just one symptom of engagement, I think. The piece that is an opinion, this is not well researched, this is my opinion, but the fact that you had a tangible experience that my grandparents are telling my children about how we needed one another after World War II for anything to happen. I grew up with pictures of the bucket brigades or the Ziegelbrigaden, where you have, you know, 100 people lined up that are handing stones one to the next to rebuild something or to clear a street. I think that the closest I've come to people talking about that kind of collaboration in my cultural context and experience in the US has been people talking about working on the farm with the family. But that is sort of us together as a family, whereas back home there was that experience of we needed our neighbor, we needed all these other people, and it didn't just take 5 or 7 of us, it needed 100 of us. And I think to some extent that does funnel even now into a willingness for collaboration and togetherness that sometimes seems to be more difficult to come by. And when you combine that with a two-party system that allows us to do a lot of us versus them, which is not the case in Austria, which is not the case in Germany, which is not the case in the Netherlands, where you have coalition governments that constantly have to not just align Democratic and Republican votes and a couple of independents, but the Pirate Party and the Green Party and the far right this and the far left this and the socialist somewhat moderate in between. I think that does allow for a greater willingness. I hope that with all that said, we can take it into our context and find sort of the value add for people to say, hey, here is a concept and a process that takes the best of the World Cafes, the open spaces, the, that fertile ground that you described, and channels it into engagement that can really make a difference for a community, for a regional government, for a country.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Teo. I do think history plays a big part. I mean, maybe England's experience in post-war also has something to do with why public consultation and public engagement is so much more active there than it is here in the US. I don't know. But
my grandpa had a friend who was a Dennis Long, who was an army medic, I want to say, in the Royal Forces, and he said something along the lines of, there's a big difference if you're the winner and your home is still intact, and when you're a winner and the city you live in is bombed to bits.
Yeah.
Something to that extent. I can't remember exactly what he said, but something to that extent.
Yeah. I agree. I think that I hope that this country can learn from others' hardship without having to experience that level of hardship directly. I want to briefly, this is not a slide. I want to briefly share something here, which is this is a report published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. This is what its cover looks like here. And it is, I can't recommend it highly enough. It is an amazing, amazing, amazing report. Part of the reason is that it's so readable. It has a lot of research that went into it, but then it'll have some really good communications people, I imagine, who really took a hand at it. They have 6 major recommendations. Their first one includes the need, or their second one, I'm not sure, includes the need for ranked choice voting as a way of bringing more diversity of perspectives into our political system, which is so narrowed down, as you were pointing out, Teo, by the two-party system. And it also includes in recommendations for the greater use of citizens' assemblies and citizen juries and things like that. And it was created by a bipartisan commission, which is really amazing. And it's kind of pointing the way to what do we need to do here in the US to reinvent American democracy for the 21st century. So I highly recommend it. We'll put the link in the chat. And
Rose,
Mhm.
I can't help but go right to the difference between individualist cultures and collective cultures. And everything you've spoken about resonates so much from the Western mindset. If you played this over again in the African, particularly South African context, do you think they would find it completely new, or would they resonate entirely with it?
Yeah, well, there's African concept of Ubuntu.
Mhm.
We are because you are, and or I am because we are. And I think actually indigenous peoples throughout, right, not just in Africa, had more of a well-developed sense of me and we, and I do talk about that in my dissertation. And at the same time, you know, the westernization and colonization and industrialization has really hit hard. So sometimes it takes a little bit of an extra effort to help people reconnect with things that are already part of their heritage. What I'm putting in the link right now is a link to a wonderful citizens assembly process that was done in Malawi. That it's a 20-minute video, and it has authentic Malawian music as the soundtrack. So it's a beautiful short film, and there, this kind of random selection process, bringing people together, having them work on a major issue, ended up incredibly activating this group of people to then continue doing this. They became sort of a watchdog for these funds that are supposed to go to communities and often get siphoned off along the way. Anyway, so yeah, there is definitely a need to introduce or reintroduce more collaborative forms of practice in many places.
Carol, I have this vision of sitting around a fire with like an Aboriginal elder and a Maori elder and a Native American chief, and telling them how excited I am that I just discovered this wisdom council process and how ingenious some of it is. And I imagine them all falling over off their little logs, belly laughing for about 20 minutes and then going, oh, the stuff that we've been doing for 1,000 years and been trying to tell you should try that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And which reminds me of Helena Norbert's Hodges work, right? She did a lot of work, I believe it was in Nepal or Bhutan, and found that the impact of westernization was such that she had to develop slideshows showing them how the leading edge in the West was doing organic agriculture. So maybe they didn't really need to buy fertilizers and was doing passive solar energy. So maybe their original forms of building actually were, you know, there's a, yeah.
It just goes deep to my heart about the benefits of intercultural work. I mean, my experience was so deep when schools partnered in Detroit and South Africa, and each one was flabbergasted by what they saw. The Detroit people thought the South African people were wearing loincloths, and the South African people thought that the US people were all rich. And that told it all.
Yeah.
How do we get wisdom councils across cultures?
Yeah.
Is my question. You've been fabulous, Rosa. Thank you as always. What a joy.
Rosa, I'll be in touch and maybe we can collaborate on some of the follow-up. I would love your reflections, but I think there's also a lot of rich, resource sharing that was going on in the chat that I want to make sure we can capture and share out and maybe add to as appropriate. There was one specific request from a couple of people, Rosa, whether you'd be willing to share some of your slides. So maybe that's something we can include in some way, shape, or form, maybe as a PDF. I do have to also hop off, and I know Steve has transitioned into his next session. So thank you all for sticking around. And Rosa, thank you for giving us time. And Carol, yes?
I want you to have the last word, but it just occurred to me, Rosa, put some of these resources into the chapter in the waffle in the library. in the Collaborative Change Library, because it would be invaluable to people who are reading your chapter. Particularly, one or two students chose it for their extra assignment in a course. So the more that is current, the better it will be.
Thank you. And I have to confess, I have not figured out how to use the new.
Well,
system.
then there's something.
Talk to Teo.
I will,
He's the-
Carol, I had Carol's point already on my list. It's on my to-do list to look at the waffle with you, as we
Awesome.
call it, the resources for the chapter.
Yeah, it reminds me that we need to get back to that. It's such an opportunity. So thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Teo.
thank you. Thank you.